those desires so hemmed by doubt. Can you please at least tell me how it happened? And she to me. Now, by the way, everybody in reading in Dante's time this poem, they knew exactly what had happened. This was kind of like, popular knowledge that Pablo and Francesca were killed by a jealous husband. And that notion of being killed by a jealous husband, yes, no question, is going to take us to Shakespeare's Othello. Of course, a number of other titles as well will immediately come to mind, right? And she to me. Now, here comes Francesca's story. It's, of course, a very famous story. No sadness is greater than in misery to rehearse memories of joy, as your teacher well can witness. It's compelling. We heard this, didn't we, in our speeches by Nestor, when he would say, it makes me sad to think about the man that I once was, in the Iliad. Or when Odysseus is asked by the Phaeacians, will you tell us where you've been? And he said, you're going to make me have to relive stories that cause me so much pain. Or Aeneas says the same thing in the Aeneid. In other words, this is the point she's making. You can have a great, great experience, but to retell it will be very painful. Because that great experience, love in this case, had to end. It had to come to some kind of tragic end, right? So we will continue at line 110. But if you have so great a craving to measure our love's first root, I'll tell it. We are the stories again that we tell, we retell, we accept or we reject. And of course, Dante the poet wants us, the reader, to understand this is a story we probably should reject. And yet, we're probably like Dante. I'm going to guess some of you guys, in fact, will go, oh, well, that's a really sad story. It'll only be later that we will come to understand that, in fact, Dante is kind of setting, the poet is kind of setting you up in the same way that the poet will set us up, and the pilgrim Dante will respond in an inappropriate way. We probably will as well. It's the brilliance of this poem. Notice how she says it. I'll tell it with the fitness of one who weeps and tells. Okay, fine, you're going to make me tell a sad story. I'll tell a sad story. One day, she says, for pleasure, we read of Lancelot. Now, of course, let's go back. 2 comments right away. Of course, we finished our study of Arthur and the Arthurian motif. We know that it, of course, is paralleling very closely the love triangle of Paris and Menelaus and Helen. So, in other words, she says, me and this man, Paulo, never named, but Paulo, is going to, we're going to sit down and we're going to start reading. Let's, by the way, notice that now she'll shift the blame away from love to a book. And it will be a very special book. It will be a book that specifically tells about how a man and a woman, not married, hanky-panky. We read of Lancelot, by love constrained. Notice how many times the word love gets used here. Alone, suspecting nothing, at our leisure is the way that Pinsky will translate this. Per diletto is the Italian word. You can see it right across on the effacing page. One of the reasons I have you guys work with the Pinsky translation is because you have the Italian there. Per diletto, for fun. Kind of like a lark, if you will. You can even see dalliance will even sound very close to this. Remember when we did Dalliance of the Eagles, that Whitman poem? Dalliance just means messing around. In other words, just for kicks, just for fun, just for ha-ha fun, we decided we would read at our leisure. By the way, remember what Plato said in Republic? Socrates said to Glaucon about having lots of leisure in their town. Remember what he said? Right. Remember that? He said, yeah, we're going to have lots of doctors if we allow for leisure. Why? Because when you have leisure, you got problems. Well, we're going to see here, for our leisure. Sometimes, at what we read, our glances joined. Notice this is compelling. They're not reading the book alone. They're reading the book together. So there's actually 3 of them. We're back to our trinities. There's Francesca, there's Paolo, and then there's the book, which is telling the story of Lancelot and Guinevere, of course, messing around on Arthur, right? Sometimes at what we read, our glances joined, looking from the book, each to the other's eyes. Oh, so in other words, they're using the book as kind of an avenue. And then the color in our faces drained, very much like Virgil's face going pale as he got ready to go into limbo. But one particular moment alone it was, defeated us. In other words, the book jacked us up. And it was at one particular moment. The longed-for smile, it said, was kissed by that most noble lover. In other words, at the moment when Lancelot and Guinevere themselves decide they cannot stop anymore their attraction. At this one, who now will never leave my side. She just keeps talking about Apollo. Kissed my mouth. trembling. In other words, they were reading the book, they got to these lines where Lancelot and Guinevere kiss, and at the moment when Lancelot and Guinevere kiss, they kissed, trembling. It's beautiful poetry, right? Trembling. A Gioletto. Now, Gioletto here is the go-between for Lancelot. You'll remember from our story, our study of Arthurian motif, that this is the go-between. Remember in our study of Chaucer, this would be the Pandarus character. In other words, the book served as like a go-between. Some have even called it a pimp, like a go-between between the two of them, right? That book, she says. Notice, now she's not blaming it on love, she's blaming it on the book. Notice the refusal to take responsibility for what it is that she did. It's almost as if she is saying, I had no choice in the matter. Of course, historically, in classical literature, she's got a precedent for this in our study of the Aeneid. I mean, some of you were really, really upset about the fact that in the study of of Dido in the Aeneid, it's as if she does not have a choice. Like she's gonna fall for this guy regardless, and it's gonna be like a heartbreaker. And it's remember, it's gonna be Juno and it's gonna be Venus that go high five. Let's watch what happens. This NASCAR wreck called love, right? That book, and so is he who wrote it. That day we read no further. Now, of course, some of you are smiling because, yes, we spent a lot of time, don't you remember, in Confessions, Book 8, talking about how St. Augustine loves sex. He knows that he should give it up. He knows that he should have a conversion experience and become a Christian, so he says in his Confessions. But he can't quite get there, and he's in the garden, you'll remember, and he hears that voice that says, take and read. And he picks up the Bible at random, and he reads it, a passage from the book of Paul that says, stop worrying about lust, stop desiring sex so much. And at that moment, he has his conversion experience. And he says, Augustine, in his Confessions, at that moment I read no further. Meaning, I had heard enough. I knew I was committed. Note the irony of what Dante is doing here, the game that he's playing. And by the way, everyone knew, intelligent readers of this poem knew Dante's Confessions. Augustine's Confessions. So they knew the game that he was playing. Think about the multiple ways that this works. Of course, they read no more means it's literally, at that point, they shut the book, they messed around, the husband came in, he killed both of them. Therefore, they read no further, right? Notice as well that the name of the guy who she's with is Paulo. And of course, Paul is the apostle writer of the New Testament that St. Augustine reads. Some scholars have pointed out, in other words, there's two Pauls at play in this story. There's the Paul of Augustine and there's the Paul of Francesca. And Francesca, some have argued, chose the wrong Paul, if you will. Do you get me? In other words, messed around with the wrong Paul. Should have been messing around with the New Testament Paul. Instead, she was messing around with Paulo. And for that, she got jacked. We read no further. All the while, that's the end of the story, by the way. All the while, the one shade spoke, Francesca. The other at her side was weeping. So Paulo, he just kind of stands there weeping the whole time. My pity overwhelmed me, and I felt myself go slack, swooning as in death. I fell like a dying body. In the same way that we saw that fainting at the conclusion of Canto 3, we have the fainting at the conclusion of Canto 5. And we kind of go, I get it. I mean, this is a powerful story, and it's kind of a sad story. There's another reading of this, by the way, that says Dante was very much in love with Beatrice. He wonders maybe to himself, if I had had the opportunity, would I have been able to be strong, or would I have given in to sexual lust in the same way that Francesca and Paolo give in to sexual lust? There's another reading of this that says that in some ways, Dante may be in fact kind of critiquing his own love poetry. A love poetry that he wrote, which maybe now Dante the poet begins to realize is not as healthy as maybe it should be. Now, of course, think about this. There's two ways to read the story of Lancelot Guinevere. One is to say, you know what? This is what happens when Lancelot Guinevere mess around. It's kind of the end of Camelot, isn't it? It's kind of the beginning of the end of the whole project. We think about the declension of state debate and discussion from Plato's Republic, Book 8 and 9, right? In other words, it only takes a single insignificant kind of moment to lead to the end of everything. Okay? But there's another reading of that story that says, well, if Lancelot and Guinevere are going to do it, then we might as well mess around with it as well. The question of how you control your desires is obviously central to this story. Notice, Dante the Pilgrim gets it wrong. Instead of saying to Francesca, you know, I hear what you're saying and it's a sad story, but the truth is you made the choice to be alone. You made the choice to pick up the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. You made the choice to go to the section of the story where they mess around, and you made the choice to close the book and never to read again. And for all of those choices, you are here. Dante the Pilgrim doesn't see that yet. We as readers of this poem are intended to see that. If not now, certainly later we are supposed to see that. Well, let's read now, work quickly at level 2 and 3. 2A, major messages. Well, obviously, love can be both amazing, but it can also be really, really destructive, right? Another major message is it's often easier, right, to blame the book or to blame love than it is to take personal responsibility for one's actions, right? Another major message here, and it's kind of subtle, but let's not miss it. It's sometimes hard to retell some stories. Stories that originally gave joy that lead to later pain when we retell them. Think about the ways in which that was true in our study of the great epic poems, those storytellers. Think about how that's also true of Dante the poet. He will say several times, man, I hope I can tell this story and tell you about the things that happened. It was quite remarkable. So we're playing that game as well. At 2B, in our symbolism, well, there's so many kinds of symbols. We mentioned Minos, who is going to wrap his tail. Think about that notion of the very kind of gross, like serpentine, wrapping the tail around. How many coils go around is how deep you go and all of that. And obviously Minos is a judge, but we're going to meet, of course, another major symbol in Francesca. Francesca's like Dido. It does beg the question about being jacked for love, right? It's an interesting circle of hell, circle 2 as well, because notice the punishment is not like being stung by wasps or being burnt by fire or anything like that. It's just being spun in a whirlwind. In other words, this is what passion is like. It controls you in powerful ways. Of course, the irony is that Aeneas ends up in limbo, while Dido and Achilles end up here, which is fascinating, right? Dido, of course, that tragic story that we're familiar with from the Aeneid. And of course, Achilles here, because of a reference in a medieval story, that Achilles in the end actually went down because of his love for Polyxena. It's fascinating. Of course, let's think about Dante as poet. Well, here you could see that he is in fact critiquing his own love poetry. To what degree is his earlier poetry as useful or as beneficial as this? It's clear that Dante the poet felt like the Divine Comedy was a far more important piece of writing because it's instructional, it's teaching you stuff, as opposed to just writing poems about love. As a politician, this is a very subtle observation, but I want you to hear it. Think about this. Dante could have had his conversation with Dido, with Helen, with Achilles. All of that would have been fascinating, but no, he chooses a contemporary. So early on in Canto 5, Dante puts all Florentines who would be reading this, oh really? You're going to exile me? Keep reading. One or two you might end up in this poem. Notice how it kind of puts you on edge. It's a political, very subtle, but a very political kind of reading of this text that says, Dante's going to put some people in his poem that are contemporaries of his. If you jack Dante up and you're reading Canto 5, you might go like this, I wonder who else is going to end up in this book, in this poem, in a not so healthy light. We'll come back to it. Of course, Dante, as philosopher, theologian, is begging a very interesting question. He's taking Virgil's Aeneid, he's taking Augustine's Confessions, and he's asking the question, is God love? Or is love God? And what about eros? Is there any place for it in the human existence? It's an interesting philosophic question. Can you control it? Or is it in fact a fire that just burns out of control? Of course, as high school students, that is a question at 3B that probably we can entertain rather easily. Some of you smiling. At 3A, of course, we have in the Iliad Helen, in the Odyssey Clytemnestra, in the Aeneid Dido. All of those are, of course, as we've said before, the blame game always does seem to go back to women. And here we have Francesca, who will speak, and Paula just stands there and weeps the whole time, right? What's your favorite jealous boyfriend text? We think about Shakespeare's Othello that comes to mind. Othello will decide to kill his own beautiful Desdemona because he thinks that his best friend's messing around with her. It's not at all happening. Iago's just a terrible villain. Finally, at 3B, Well, you knew this question was coming. Let's ask it. What was a time when love was a destruction, a devastation in your life that led to all kinds of lamentation? What was a time, how about this for a question in 3B, what was a time when you blamed the book, quote unquote, blamed the book? In other words, you didn't take responsibility. You blamed somebody else. When we get to our Paradise Lost, we're going to see the same game being played where Eve is going to blame the serpent, and then Adam's going to blame Eve. It's human nature, we might say, to try and not take personal responsibility. Why is that? And what was a time when you kind of struggled to do that? Or you did take responsibility? What was a time when retelling a story of joy brought you pain because you realized it was over, right? Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught will be a line that we will read later by the great romantic poet to a skylark, Shelley's classic poem To a Skylark. Is there a time in your life when reviewing a great story, a happy story, leads to some kind of pain? We certainly have seen this in the epic tradition over and over again. All right, well, that's Canto 5. Let's move on now to Canto 6. And from sex, we go to overeating, gluttony, all of the major, 7 deadly sins, as the church will call them, we're going to deal with here. And they will all get their day. I hope you're enjoying this study. I hope it's challenging you. Thank you.